Tabletop gaming is an avenue that simulates more precisely than video games, which is only one reason why it's still relevant today. There's a lot of intuitive things about them that really make things realistic, or at least adjacent, but there's also a decent amount of things that don't quite make sense. That's what we're talking about today. Here's the disclaimer part of the video. I'm going to talk about 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. So you don't have to go into the comments and go, oh, but in Pathfinder or whatever. If you want, you can talk about what the most realistic tabletop game is. That's cool. Second thing, I'm not disparaging any of the mechanics here that don't make sense. You'll find that a lot of these mechanics aren't realistic and they're put in place either to make the game more fun or more balanced or both. As a dungeon master myself, I prefer fun over realism to a point, of course. That's why we play in a fantasy universe. This is merely just pointing it out. If you have a house rule that keeps things fun, but are more realistic, let me know. I'd be interested to see what creative things you come up with. Alright, so the first thing. Ability checks, saving throws, modifiers, proficiencies, etc. This is more of a general thing that applies to tabletop and not just D&D, but I'm mentioning it anyway. This is great at simulating something that we take for granted in many video games. No one is going to perform at 100% of their capacity all the time. Every day is going to be a little different, performance-wise. There are so many conditions that can affect your everyday life. How many hours, minutes, and seconds you slept, what you ate, when you ate, how much you ate, the temperature outside, the temperature inside, the difference between the two. I could go on and on and on with these everyday variables that can affect something you do in the slightest way. Well, a D20 covers a broad spectrum of that kind of condition that you're in. Maybe the stars aligned, and you're at your absolute best. Natural 20. Maybe you're rattled, tilted, and you hurt yourself trying to do an everyday workout. Natural 1. But on most occasions, you'll find that you're somewhere in between. And then modifiers and passive skills really bring that concept home. If you have a +5 in strength versus a +2 in strength, you have an advantage. That doesn't mean you'll win every time. But if you two were in the same condition, say you both rolled a 15, you win. Maybe the +2 strength opponent is in his best condition, and you're thinking about your dinner 3 days ago and how you overcooked that steak. Then you might actually lose. Passive skills are great to ensure that your ability scores matter a bit more than just the basics. If you have a 20 strength and the DM calls for a strength check to lift a 25-pound bag of wheat, you should respect the DM, but at the same time, that's a bit ridiculous. Maybe under the right conditions, like if you're exhausted, you're at 1 hit point and poisoned, then maybe I get the DM giving you a low DC check. At 20 strength, you have a push, drag, and lift capacity of 600 pounds. That gives everybody limits, but also makes high-strength characters able to do things passively. Now, speaking of conditions, let's talk about how damage doesn't affect your ability to perform, except with a concentration check. This is something that doesn't make sense, but I would hate to implement this kind of thing in my game. If you're on death's door, you just simply won't have the same capacity to fight as when you were at full HP. Say you're a 12th level barbarian with 150 max HP and you're down to 5 HP. You've taken 145 points of damage. Where was that damage inflicted? You still have the same movement speed, the same accuracy, same damage rolls, same reflexes, everything. If you have a severe leg injury, you aren't going to move as fast. If you have serious injuries in your arms, you probably won't have the same force behind your attacks. You might have blood obscuring your vision from a head injury. You might be lightheaded from blood loss. By the way, there's no mechanic for blood loss in 5th edition, which I'm certainly glad for, other than, say, death saving throws. I'd really hate to keep track of that kind of shit. Now, I can already hear some of your responses already. But PentSage, adrenaline. Yes, adrenaline can help you push past some injuries, but it can only do so much. There's a reason swords have evolved to have more intricate hand protection. You see, shields and armor became less relevant as guns became more relevant. So swords were modified for 2 things, for cavalry and for duels. This is my saber. It's a Union officer saber from Civil War. Go just a quick showcase here. Okay, this is not so much important, so is the hilt. Okay, so this became more widespread, while the longsword practically phased out. You also have the rapier, a very popular dueling sword, and the small sword. Most of them had basket hilt or similar type handguards. This one here is what they call a knuckle bow. So like when you hold it, you know, that protects your hand. If a sword comes in, you could still potentially stab. But if you have your hand in a decent guard, a slash is not really going to come through so much. Um, Definitely better than like a cross guard, which would only, up here. But if something comes down here, um, you're kind of fucked. Um, so, yeah, essentially, if you got hit in the hands by an opponent's sword, you're pretty much fucked. With the sort of phasing out of armor, you weren't really wearing gauntlets. You might have been wearing, like, I don't know, leather gloves, but, like, something of this caliber would definitely cut right through that. Like, can you imagine like a rapier fencer against the longsword fighter without armor, where the fencer, he just stabbed the fighter's hands and forced him to drop his weapon? Some idiot from the crowd yells, "Dude, you forgot to activate your adrenaline." Also, the Battlemaster has disarming attack, so at least that's a thing. The other point that kind of smashes the adrenaline argument is that you can perform the same physical feats in and out of combat, in and out of stressful situations. While we're on the subject of injuries, let's talk about a pretty controversial subject, the called shot house rule. I'm actually going to argue on both sides in this, because I think the lack of a called shot mechanic makes sense in most cases, but not in some other cases. In battle, players want to do a called shot in order to inflict a specific injury on the opponent. I want to disarm the opponent by cutting at his exposed hands. First of all, if you're not a battlemaster, you're just making that class's maneuver less special. Or even if you are a battlemaster, don't even take disarming attack. Just use feinting attack or precision attack in conjunction with a called shot, and boom, you just cheated the system to use two maneuvers at once. Second, it's not so simple as just aiming for their hands for a penalty to your attack. I think there's a misconception about how combat works in D&D, and it stems from the fact that we do things in turns. It's easy to forget that everything is happening at roughly the same time. I think it gets doubly worse for JRPG fans, like myself, that get the turn-based combat stuck in their head. It's just not happening like that. Just as you're trying to attack, the opponent is trying to block or dodge. This isn't Fallout. It's not so simple as, it's your turn. What would you like to do? I take my greatsword and cut his head off. Roll for attack. 21 to hit. That hits. 15 damage. Alright, second attack. Dude, I cut his head off. Well, as you swing for his head, he manages to bring up his sword to block. Unfortunately for him, the momentum is too strong, and his block is only able to redirect the sword into his collarbone. He's looking pretty hurt, though. Now, the one argument you can make for a called shot realistically is when an opponent is not really moving and you have the drop on them. Say you're a 10th level rogue and your wizard casts invisibility on you so that you can sneak up on the bad guy. You roll a 20 on stealth for a total of 33 and you manage to get behind him. He's stationary and you have a clear shot at his throat. You have advantage on your attack and you roll another natural 20. At 10th level, you're a battle-hardened rogue. You're no stranger to combat and definitely familiar with sneak attacks hitting weak points. If you're the DM, what do you do in that situation? If you've allowed called shots till this point, do you allow the rogue to one-shot the bad guy without even having them roll damage? This is another case where realistically it makes perfect sense to go with, but it might break the game. I think I've allowed minor called shots in my games before, but never something crazy dramatic like that scenario, nor would I. I know that's inconsistent DMing, but oh well. Okay, now something else that I could never make realistic sense of is the way extra attack is implemented. So, you got this level 11 fighter with heavy armor and a giant two-handed maul. He can attack 3 times as his action. Also, if he wants, he can just get another 3 attacks once per short rest. I'll come back to Action Surge briefly later though. So, you also have a level 20 rogue. She is wearing magical studded leather and wields a magical dagger. She can attack, wait for it, once per action. She might have max dexterity, which according to the rules is about agility and deftness, and it doesn't affect anything. She might even have the same strength score as the level 11 fighter. Mechanically, this works, because rogues do a ridiculous amount of damage in just that one hit. If that rogue is an assassin, by the way, she has access to Death Strike, which can and will outdamage everything else in the game if it succeeds. Even if they succeed against Death Strike, the Assassinate feature still applies and the rogue gets an auto crit. This is all contingent upon the enemy being surprised, but still. Sneak attack does a boatload of damage, especially when crits are being had. Again, I have to stress it because I know otherwise someone will explain to me in the comments. I know why rogues don't have extra attack. All I'm saying is that logically it doesn't really hold up. Next, group checks. These are great. Group checks are nice mechanically to make the adventuring a little less tedious at times, but they also make sense in that the party members help each other out. Most of the time. Insert entire party of lone wolves here as an exception. Let's say that the scenario is rock climbing, and the entire party is tethered together by ropes. Naturally, the stronger characters can help pull up the weight easier. If a weaker character slips, the stronger character can help stabilize them. It's better than Caleb rolled a 1 on athletics, so he loses his grip and falls to the bottom, losing his entire progress. Yasha, you wanted to stop him from falling? Oh, too bad, he failed his check. Everyone else succeeded, so you continue on leaving the poor wizard behind. And yes, that's the only critical role reference you get out of me in this video. Moving on. The actions you can take in battle aside from attack and casting a spell. They really add an extra dimension to the game that a video game can only give you minor pieces of. The dodge action makes you harder to hit. Remember, everything happens in 6-second intervals. So instead of using that brief moment to attack, you focus on defending. Completely realistic. The help action. You can give someone advantage by double teaming. I don't even need to explain this one. Dash. You forgo your attack so that you can run further. Again, self-explanatory. Take Fire Emblem for instance. In that game, you can move and attack like in D&D, but even if you don't attack or do anything else, you can't move past your normal movement squares. I'm not mad at Fire Emblem for not implementing this, it just doesn't make logical sense. In D&D's case, the dash action does make sense. Disengage is one of the weird ones that I don't think makes a lot of sense, although it can circumstantially. You forgo an attack to somehow make your opponent not attack you as you try to run. Funny enough, disengage is the only action in the handbook that doesn't explain what it actually does, only what the result is. I can understand if you're flanking with an ally and you use a moment when the opponent looks at your ally to take off running, but you can disengage with somebody focusing on you and only you. Moving on, hide. Also self-explanatory. I also like that they distinguish between hiding and getting cover. You can know exactly where your enemy is without having direct line of sight. Hiding is attempting to obscure your location from the enemy. That's something I think DMs get wrong, that you can just hide anywhere if you roll high enough. You magically get advantage on your attack. I'm sure I've gotten it wrong too at points. But anyway, search is obvious, so no need to talk about that. Use object is intuitive and gives you a sort of insert desired action here and see what the DM says. Held actions or ready actions are great tools in this game. Not only deepens initiative-based combat, but it makes perfect sense that you might want to time something very specifically. The game rules are specific enough to make it realistic enough too. Great stuff. Next, I want to talk about attack rolls and how they apply to enemies. If you use a strength-based weapon, your bonus is your strength and proficiency. This has some logical problems when you take into consideration the different kinds of enemies. Take a level 3 barbarian with 18 strength holding a great axe. They have a plus 6 to hit with their weapon. Put them against a hobgoblin captain with armor. Now put them against a monk with the same armor class while unarmored. Barbarian has the same chance to hit both, even though realistically it would be a very different fight. The monk's unarmored AC comes from their dex and wisdom, which is their agility and awareness. The Hobgoblin Captain has half plate armor, which gives him a max of +2 to bonus from dex. So in other words, the strength of the Barbarian is allowing them to hit the speedy monk easier. I guess you can argue that strength can affect the weapon's attack speed, thereby making it harder to dodge, and the proficiency bonus is the skill in that scenario. But that also brings up an issue when we include finesse weapons. A rapier going against full plate doesn't really do well, and yet a level 3 fighter with 18 dex has the same chance of doing damage to full plate enemy as the aforementioned barbarian. Then the argument becomes, but the finesse weapon allows for a more nimble use of the weapon, so maybe the rapier finds a gap in armor that the barbarian didn't. And I'm almost there with you. Almost there with you. Until you switch the barbarian's weapon to the same rapier. They can use the 18 strength to have the same chance of doing damage to the full plate enemy as the fighter using it nimbly. And as we know, a rapier can flex very well. It doesn't really pierce full plate. Also, switch the barbarian's weapon to anything with proficiency. It's the same 2-hit bonus no matter the weapon. You're telling me that this rage-filled monster has the same chance to hit an enemy with any weapon, just using their strength and proficiency? Going back to the monk example, the barbarian can use a spear or a 2-handed great axe, and they have the same 2-hit bonus against the speedy monk. A spear is so much harder to avoid than a great axe, it's not even close. The barbarian is still proficient with it, and the strength is the same. So yeah, it doesn't really make much sense. Mechanically, I get it. You shouldn't have to invest in both dex and strength just to ensure that you have good 2-hit and damage. Just like how you wouldn't want to have to invest in intelligence to learn more spells as a bard. While we're on the subject of weapons, I just want to say that the weapon damage table is very wrong. The rapier does the same damage as the spear held with 2 hands. What? Do you know how flexible the rapier is? That shit is great for piercing, but it was made for unarmored combat. The spear is a weapon of war. It was meant to fight as the main weapon in all conditions. Lightly armored, heavily armored, etc. Didn't do great against heavy armor, but still better than any one-handed sword, that's for sure. And no, I'm not getting it confused with a pike. It's a very different weapon for very different usage. The longsword does more damage than a spear and equal damage to a battle axe. In terms of chopping, there are a few instances where having more edge contact is better for cutting, but usually a battle axe will outperform a longsword, and it's not even close. Why does the mace do less damage than a quarterstaff? Quarterstaff is serious business, don't get me wrong, but a flanged mace has a lot of advantages in terms of damage, especially when we talk about getting through armor. There's a lot more I can talk about, but that's just a few examples. This does bring up another point that certain weapons do better against certain armors or lack thereof. When I was setting up to DM my game, I was initially going to house rule bonuses and penalties depending on the weapon versus armor matchup, but I quickly realized that it would be robbing the game of the simplicity of 5th edition. The game purposely avoids a lot of bonuses and penalties, so that the combat isn't dragged into math hell. Well, I have a +6 to hit, but -2 because I'm using a sword against a brigandine, but +5 because I'm flanking, -3 because my neighbor mooned me yesterday, but +4 because my wife blew me last night, so that's, what now? Okay, so I promised to get to Action Surge, and I just want to briefly touch on the fact that it's kind of weird. The way it's described is kind of like adrenaline rush on command, but it somehow allows the fighter to attack like a billion times in 6 seconds, and then if you're a wizard and you take 2 levels of fighter to get Action Surge, you learn how to fight with weapons and armor, so now you can use that knowledge to cast 2 spells on your turn. Okay? Grappling is something that I find missing from a lot of games and shows and movies. You are somewhat limited in what you can do without the grappler feat or having a spell with a similar effect. I think it's somewhat odd that you need a feat to be able to pin someone down. It doesn't take any specialized training, although it does if you're going for something specific, which is where I feel they could have made the grappler feat more about going for specific pins. I don't know. It's kind of minor, but it comes up once in a while in games. Lastly, I want to talk about death saving throws. I think this is a really good mechanic that simulates something very real that isn't often thought about in video games. 0 HP means going unconscious, but also in a critical state. Sometimes you can miraculously come back from that state naturally and wake up, aka rolling a natural 20 on death save. It does happen in real life, although rare. Similarly, someone can go into that state and just die very quickly. Of course, the ability to make it worse with damage makes total sense, and obviously healing resets that condition. It can make sense, although I think if you're dropping once or twice around, realistically your state would worsen over time. Mechanically, I would rather it be this way to not make it harder on the players. Death saving throws are definitely scary enough as is. Overall, I want to say that the game design behind 5e is pretty brilliant. When you break things down to this level, you can really see the meticulous quality of life choices that they made in order to balance fun and verisimilitude. Is it perfect? By no means. Maybe in another video I can talk about mechanical issues that I see, but that's a different subject entirely that will take a lot of time as well. So that's it for today. I'm sure I could find or nitpick on some things, but I think this video has gone on long enough. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. This is the first video on the channel where I talk about Dungeons & Dragons, exclusively at least. If you guys liked it, and if you want more D&D content, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.